A diorama base can help complement the build of a scale model. In my previous video I showed you how I built the Revell Lancaster B.Mk.III in 1/72 scale. Join me in this one as I complete the build by scratch building the airfield base, maintenance scaffold and include some figures. Hi, I'm Matt and you're watching Model Minutes. As usual, before I start the video, please remember that adult supervision may be required due to the use of sharp tools and toxic paints and chemicals. If you'd like to see a more in-depth look at the Revell Lancaster model kit, you'll find two videos about it on my channel. The first video is an unboxing review where I take a detailed look at the contents of the box, the sprues, decals and instructions. Whilst the second video, as previously mentioned, focuses on the build of the kit. The first thing I'm going to do is find the figures I want to use. I've got this box of RAF Personnel figures from Airfix, and although the scale is slightly different at 1/76, I don't think it will look too noticeable at the end. Again, I did a review on these figures last year, so there is a video on that too. Having identified the people I wanted to use, I simply twisted them off the sprue. I'm going to cut the display bases off the bottom of the figures later, so it won't matter if it looks a little untidy at the moment. I'm going to use this cheap matte black spray paint as the base colour on the people. The plastic that Airfix have chosen to use is a little rubbery and not ideal for painting as it can flake off. I'm using this paint as a base as I've had success with it in the past, and I think it will help key the surface for the next layers. Spraying from side to side, I evenly coat the models. A word of warning, please ensure you use the correct protective equipment and environment when spray painting. With that black paint now dry, the next colour I will use is Humbrol 96 RAF Blue Matte Enamel Paint. This was painted on the uniform of the figures and I used it straight from the tin. A fine brush will help get it in all the right places. It would seem that I neglected to press the record button whilst painting the rest of the figures, but I used Humbrol 61 matte flesh acrylic on the hands and faces, 29 matte earth was used on the visible hair, parachute and boots of the pilot, 85 satin black was painted onto the shoes of the other figures, and 103 cream highlighted the parachute straps on the pilot. This painting would have followed the same process as before, using a fine paintbrush to get it in all the right places. Although I did make an attempt at cutting off the excess flash using a knife, you can see that there is still some visible in these pictures. But from normal viewing distances, it's not too noticeable. To finish these figures off and to try and highlight the details, they were each given a coat of Citadel Nuln Oil acrylic wash. This will flow into the recessed areas and create shadow, helping to give a more three-dimensional effect. It is worth noting that the bicycle on one of the figures was simply left in the black spray painted colour. With the wash dry, the bases can be carefully cut away from the figures, and I had to take care here to make sure I only cut away the base and didn't accidentally remove the shoes or legs as well. These guys are now ready to be added to the diorama, so I'll put them to the side for now and move on to the next thing. Let's talk about the build of the scaffold. I took my inspiration for this from various photos I saw online following a quick Google search, but ultimately it's from my own imagination and not to any particular design. This took me a while to get right. Attempt number 1. This saw me cutting lengths of thin steel wire and bending them to the shape I thought would look right. I decided to solder these lengths of wire together, but found this to be a little difficult. Having got so far in the process, it just didn't look right to me. The wire was too thick and it had little bends and kinks in places that I just wasn't happy with. So I put that to one side and had another go. Attempt number 2. I didn't record this one because it was absolutely terrible. I thought it would be a good idea to use the paper sticks from cotton buds, but it looked even worse because, you know, it was made from cotton buds. Attempt number 3. Looking back, this is what I should have done the entire time. I stretched some leftover plastic sprue into thin rods and then cut them to length. I used Revell contactor cement to glue them together into a basic framework. I made 2 side frames and then cemented them together to form the general shape of the scaffold. It's really starting to take shape now, so the next thing was to glue the platform to the top of the scaffold for the mechanic to stand on. I used Yoo-Hoo multi-purpose glue to do this. It was applied to the top braces of the scaffold, then I cut a sanding stick to the right length and placed it on top. I'm using the sanding stick as the platform as it has a texture to it, which I think will look quite good. I found this U-shaped frame in my spares box, and I'm pretty sure it came from the Airfix Willys Jeep kit. I'm going to glue it onto one side of the platform to act as a handrail for the mechanic and make it a little safer for him whilst he's working on the aircraft engines. It still didn't look like it was quite finished, and I wondered about how the mechanics would move the scaffold around. From my research, I remember seeing some wheels on the scaffolds, so took another dive into the spares box and found 2 wheels from an Airfix Spitfire kit, which I cemented an axle between them and then glued it into place. The axle again was simply some stretch sprue, and it was cemented into position on the bottom of the scaffold. And that's pretty much finished. All I need to do now is paint it. The same black spray paint I used on the figures made a reappearance and was used to paint the entire scaffold. I thought that this would be enough, but if you wanted to apply different paints or maybe even a camouflage scheme, you probably could. Some extra detailing such as dry brushing silver paint to replicate chipping could also be done, but I was quite happy to leave it as it was. With that done, let's move on to the diorama base. I started out by cutting the box the Lancaster came in, so that I had a large rectangle of card. I then cut some squares out of more card, which would be used to represent the tarmac. I glued the large rectangle of card to the base, which would help give strength to the base and be the area for the grass. Then the smaller rectangles were glued alongside to give the impression of a paved area. Humbrol 64 light grey acrylic paint was brushed onto the tarmac areas as the base colour. I used a medium brush to get quick coverage. A few layers might be needed as I thinned the paint in the pot using Tamiya acrylic thinner X20A, as this particular pot of paint was coming to the end of its life and was running out. Humbrol 29 was also thinned in the pot and then brushed onto the grass areas to give the impression of mud. I did my best to avoid painting the tarmac areas with this colour. Humbrol 33 matte black was then dry brushed down the joints of the tarmac. I hoped that this would start to introduce shade and contrast between the two parts. I also then dry brushed it over the top of the rectangles to further introduce the impression of dirt and weathering. With all the paint dry, it's time to apply the grass. White PVA glue was brushed over the entire brown area, whilst also some small places on the joins of the tarmac. This glue does take a little time to properly dry, but it will dry clear. I used Hornby Scale Scenics R7178 Meadow Static Scatter material to represent the grass. It was applied through the use of a manual static shaker pot and covered the entire base. This product is quite good as the static charge on the fibres of the grass will cause them to stand and look a little more realistic. I tapped off the excess scatter material, which I would save and use in a future project. The display base can now be left to fully dry. The main elements of the diorama are now complete, so let's bring them all together. I simply positioned the Revell Lancaster on the display base. I'm not going to glue it down or anything in case I feel like moving it around or doing something else with it later. A tiny amount of glue was applied to the feet of the figures, and then they were pressed into the places on the tarmac that I thought would look good. I positioned the scaffold next to the nacelle with the engine that was visible, and then glued the mechanic to the top. And that's it. My diorama is now complete. Yes, there are lots of extra details that I could add, such as chocks for the wheels and even other vehicles and equipment that are available in kit form. That might be something to do for a future video though. The idea I had for this scene was along the lines of the pilot has just returned from a mission and was debriefing his commanding officer whilst the rest of the crew had already departed to get some well-earned rest. Perhaps the pilot had reported an issue with one of the engines, so a mechanic was giving it a quick inspection. Meanwhile, a messenger on a bicycle is cycling towards them, perhaps with news of a future operation. I think my diorama complements the Lancaster quite well. It's not too busy, so doesn't draw the attention from the aircraft, but it does have enough small details if you look for them. Once I'd figured out how to build the scaffold, it actually wasn't too hard, and I think it looks alright. The base was relatively simple and easy to construct, not requiring any difficult or complicated techniques, and the figures are to a reasonable quality. That being said, I wish the figures had been moulded in a harder plastic, as the paint is still at risk of flaking off, and I have noticed a few small flakes here and there if I knock them by accident. Provided I'm careful though, it won't really be an issue. But what do you think of my finished diorama? I had quite a lot of fun doing this one, and now I'm looking forward to my next big project. Let me know in the comments if I should do more like this in the future. As always, honourable mention to my patrons over on Patreon. Massive thanks to these guys for the support that they give me. It goes straight back into purchasing new kits and supplies to keep that content flowing. To find out what pledging means and the perks you get, including early access to videos, take a look at the links in the description. Don't forget that you can also connect with me on social media. I'm on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook and my own Discord server. Oh, and if you made it this far, please click that like button if you enjoyed the video, and if you're new here, please consider subscribing with notifications on so you never miss a new upload. All that's left to say is thanks for watching, and I'll see you all on the workbench again next time.